The sky stretched wide and merciless over the naval base that morning, a pale sun burning through layers of gray mist. The sea wind howled against the steel fences, rattling chains and sending a low hum across the dock, where soldiers stood in perfect lines, boots, gleaming eyes forward, and hearts pounding beneath their pressed uniforms. Among them stood a woman, silent, unmoving her name tag. Half torn, her medic uniform faded and creased from long months at sea. She was smaller than the others. Yet, there was something about the way she stood, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, that made even the taller men shift uneasily beside her. Her eyes carried the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who had come back from a place where most never returned. Rumors had already spread across the base about the new medic who had transferred in from a closed assignment somewhere far off the record. Some said she had been rescued from an ambush. Others whispered that she was the only survivor of a black operation that no one dared to speak of, but no one knew for sure. And she never spoke to confirm or deny any of it. She simply carried on with her duties, precise, calm her silence, a wall that no one dared to climb that morning. The base was alive with the tension of inspection. Day sailors scrubbed the decks, officers barked orders, engines roared to life. The air was filled with the metallic scent of oil and the faint sting of salt from the ocean beyond the barricades. The Admiral was expected any moment, his arrival always marked by strict discipline and sudden fear, and as the soldiers lined up in rows, the woman stood at the far end, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something older than commands when the black convoy appeared over the rise of the dock. A shiver ran through the ranks. The Admiral stepped out of the car, his uniform immaculate, his face carved from years of command. He walked down the line, inspecting each soldier, his boots echoing. On the metal plates, his presence heavy enough to still the waves themselves. He nodded to some, frowned at others, his words crisp, his eyes sharp. But when he reached the woman, he paused, his gaze locked on hers for a fraction of a second too long. It was as if something flickered in his expression, a faint shadow of recognition that he quickly buried behind the steel of authority. He asked for her name. His tone clipped. She responded quietly, her voice steady, yet distant. The Admiral studied her again, then moved on, pretending to find no reason to question further. But she noticed it. The hesitation, the flicker. The way his hand had trembled ever so slightly when he took the clipboard from the aide beside him. She saw it because she had seen that look before, the look of someone trying to remember something they wished they could forget. The inspection continued through the blazing heat of noon, sweat running down collars, tension thick enough to choke the air when it finally ended. The Admiral dismissed them with a sharp salute. His words drowned by the roar of engines and the crash of waves. The ranks broke apart. Soldiers rushed to shade, laughing, joking, pushing each other, the way soldiers do when relief replaces fear, but the woman did not move. She remained by the dock, watching the Admiral speak with his officers near the command tower. His voice carried faintly through the wind. She could hear fragments of it. Logistics orders, upcoming drills, but none of it mattered. Because her focus was not on what he said, but on the faint scar running along his left hand. A scar she had seen once before, long ago when everything was burning and the sky had turned red with smoke. She turned away, tightening her grip on the small pouch tied to her belt. Inside it was a folded photograph, old and stained, the corners worn from too much holding. The picture showed 7 faces standing together, smiling under a flag. 6 of them were gone now, buried under reports marked confidential. Only one had returned, and she had promised the others that she would find the truth. She would look into the eyes of the man whose signature sealed their fate and make him remember what he had done. The waves crashed against the hulls, the seagulls screamed overhead, and the base intercom crackled with static calling for Officer Elena Voss to report to the command tent. Immediately, the soldiers nearby glanced toward her, whispering quietly as she straightened her uniform and walked forward. Her steps calm yet heavy with a purpose that none of them could see. Inside the command tent, the air was cool from the hum of electric fans. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking operations that most on the base were not cleared to know about. The Admiral stood near the center, leaning over the table as aides moved around him. His voice was stern, but when she entered the room, everything stopped. Conversations cut off, papers stilled. The Admiral looked up, his expression unreadable. Then, he dismissed everyone with a wave of his hand until only the two of them remained. The silence that followed was sharper than any blade. He asked her again where she had come from. His tone controlled but edged with curiosity. She replied that her transfer was approved by Central Command. Her records were incomplete because the mission she came from had been erased, classified beyond clearance. The Admiral frowned, flipping through her file, tapping his finger against the empty sections. He said that he didn't like mysteries on his base. She told him that some mysteries kept people alive. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Then she noticed it again, that faint tremor in his hand, the way his eyes avoided hers for just a moment too. Long it was enough to confirm what she already suspected. He was there that day, the day everything went wrong. She could see it written in the tension of his posture, the shallow breaths he tried to hide. The past was crawling back to him inch by inch. He dismissed her with a warning to follow orders without question. She saluted without a word and turned to leave. But just before she stepped outside, he called her name. His voice lower now, as if unsure of his own command. He asked quietly if she was injured, his eyes drifting to the faint red stain spreading across her sleeve. She said no, sir, and walked away, her voice calm, though her pulse thundered in her ears. Outside the tent, the sky had begun to darken, clouds rolling in from the sea like bruises across the horizon. The wind carried the smell of an approaching storm. She stood by the edge of the dock, looking out at the endless water, her reflection trembling on the surface beneath her calm face. She could feel the memory of that night, returning the explosion, the screams, the sound of metal tearing apart, the fire swallowing the names she still whispered in her sleep. She closed her eyes, her hand resting on the pouch again, and whispered softly, "Not yet soon." Then she turned back toward the base lights, now flickering under the first touch of rain, unaware that behind her the Admiral was still standing by the flap of the tent, staring after her, his fingers tracing the scar on his hand and his mind whispering. A name he had not spoken in 6 months, the name that was supposed to belong to the dead. And in that moment, the storm finally broke over the sea. The rain hammered the docks through the night waves, crashing like restless spirits against the concrete walls, the base lights flickering in the storm as if the sea itself was trying to drown out the truth buried beneath it. By morning, the air was heavy with damp and salt. The soldiers moved slower, yawning through drills, their boots splashing through puddles. But Elena Voss was already awake, her uniform dry, her eyes sharper than the horizon. She had spent the night inside the infirmary, cleaning the surgical trays again and again, just to quiet the storm inside her head. She had not slept since the inspection. Her thoughts circling around the Admiral, the scar, the flicker in his eyes. She knew he remembered something. But memory alone was not enough. She needed proof. Outside, the wind had softened, but the whispers had not. The soldiers talked about her more now. How the Admiral had called her to the tent. How she had walked out untouched and silent. No one ever walked out from a private meeting with Admiral Rains without being shaken, but she had, and that made them uneasy. They started watching her more closely, testing her with jokes and small talk, but her silence stayed firm. Her eyes never lifted from her work. She was not there to make friends. She was there for answers. At noon, the alarm siren sounded across the base, signaling a training exercise. The sound pierced through every building like a blade. The soldiers rushed to their positions, the engines roared again, and the air filled with the rhythm of command. Elena was assigned to standby medical duty, but instead of waiting, she followed the Admiral's convoy as it moved toward the north hangar, pretending to check supplies in the field tent from where she could see the command briefing through the half-open door. She saw maps scattered across the table again, red pins, black markers, and the Admiral's finger tracing along the same route she had seen before 6 months ago, the one that led to the disaster, the operation that was never supposed to exist. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, her hands tightening. Around the strap of her bag as she listened, he was speaking to his officers about a possible retrieval mission, a location marked on the map deep inland. It was the same region where her team had fallen, the same ground that had swallowed the men and women she had once called family. She heard him mention the word classified again, and that was enough to send fire through her veins. When the meeting ended, she turned away, moving fast toward the barracks, her boots echoing through the narrow halls. She opened her locker, her hands trembling as she pulled out the folded photograph again. This time, she unfolded it completely, her eyes tracing each face one by one until she reached the one standing at the far right. Tall, clean, shaven eyes calm and sure, the officer who had once promised to bring them home, Admiral Rains, the man now commanding the very base she stood on. Her breath caught in her chest as the door behind her creaked open, a shadow falling across the locker. She turned, expecting a soldier. But it was the base security officer, a man with narrow eyes and a smile too smooth. He said the Admiral had requested her presence again. She asked why he only shrugged and motioned toward the corridor, saying orders. Were orders she followed without a word, though inside her pulse raced like thunder. The hall stretched long and cold, the sound of footsteps echoing through the metallic silence until they reached the command office. The guard opened the door and left her there alone. The Admiral stood by the window, his back to her, watching the storm clouds gathering again over the sea. He spoke without turning, asking if she had served before her current posting. She said, "Yes, sir." He asked where she hesitated, then said Field Operations under Command 7, his head tilted slightly, that old number bringing something back to life in his memory. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as if trying to see through her. She stood straight, her expression calm, though her muscles tensed under the weight of his stare. He stepped closer, his boots quiet against the polished floor, his voice lower now when he asked if she remembered the mission codenamed Emberfall. She froze for a moment. That name burned like fire inside her chest. Then she nodded. He said it was unfortunate that they lost good people that day, but she interrupted him, her voice steady, saying that good people were not lost, they were abandoned. His eyes darkened, but he said nothing. She took a step forward, saying that she remembered the explosion, the screaming, the orders that never came, the signal that was cut off. She said she remembered hearing his voice on the radio telling them extraction was 5 minutes away, when in truth it never came. The Admiral's jaw tightened. He said she was mistaken, that she must have been confused from trauma, but she pulled something from her pocket, a small metal tag covered in dirt and dried blood. It belonged to one of her team members. She placed it on the desk between them. His eyes fell on it, and for the first time he looked uncertain. His voice faltered as he asked where she found it. She said under the wreckage when she crawled out 3 days later. He looked away, his hands gripping the desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The silence stretched thin between them, filled only by the distant rumble of thunder. Finally he said, she was not supposed to have survived. She said she knew, and that was why she came back. His head snapped up at her words, his eyes wide. She told him she had returned not for vengeance, but for truth. She wanted to know who gave the order to abandon them. He said it was not his call, it came from higher. She asked who, he said he could not say. She told him then that silence was guilt, and guilt demanded witness. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. The weight of years pressing on his shoulders, he said she did not understand the politics, the chain of command, the cost of keeping nations stable. She said she understood enough to know that her friends had died begging for help, while signatures on a report sealed their fate. He looked at her then with something like sorrow mixed with fear. He asked quietly what she wanted from him, and she said only the truth. But before he could respond, the intercom on his desk crackled with static. Then a voice came through reporting a security breach near the storage facility. The Admiral's expression shifted instantly. From guilt to command, he told her to stay put and strode out the door. She waited a few seconds, then followed, moving silently down the corridor. The storm outside had grown louder, the rain drumming against the windows as alarms echoed across the base. She slipped through the shadows until she reached the upper deck, where she saw the Admiral speaking urgently with two men. She did not recognize men in unmarked uniforms handing him a sealed folder. She crouched behind a stack of crates, straining to hear. But the wind tore away the words. Still, she caught fragments: project reactivation, the same code name from the map Emberfall. She knew then that the past was not over, that the mission that had killed her team was being revived. As the Admiral turned toward the hangar, she stepped back, pressing her hand to her ribs where the old wound ached beneath the uniform. The pain a reminder of everything she had buried and everything she still had to expose. Her breath came slow, controlled her. Mind cold and focused, she whispered to herself, not yet, not until he sees what he signed away. She disappeared into the rain, her figure blending with the storm, while behind her the base lights flickered one by one as if the island itself was preparing for what was coming. The rain did not stop for 2 days. The sea pounded against the break wall as if trying to reach the secrets buried within the base. Every corridor smelled of rust and oil and wet boots. Soldiers moved in hurried steps, their faces pale with exhaustion. The training exercise had been called off without explanation, and everyone sensed that something was wrong. Elena Voss kept her head down, working double shifts in the infirmary, stitching cuts, cleaning wounds, pretending to be just another medic, yet every hour she listened to the intercom. Every time the Admiral's name was announced, she felt her heartbeat rise and her chest tighten with a mixture of anger and anticipation. The nights were worse. The wind screamed across the roofs like the voices of the dead, and sleep brought only fragments of memory. The crash, the fire, the screams, the light fading in the eyes of her team. She saw their faces again and again until dawn tore the dreams apart each morning. She washed her face in cold water and stared at her reflection, seeing not herself, but the shadow of the woman who should have died. She whispered to that shadow to wait a little longer. The truth was close now. She could feel it pulsing in the air, around her like static before a lightning strike. On the third night, the Admiral called her again, this time, not to his office, but to the infirmary itself. His tone over the intercom was calm but distant, like a man trying to steady his voice over something deeper. She arrived to find him standing beside a wounded soldier, one of the security officers from the North Sector. His shoulder bandaged, his uniform torn from an explosion. The Admiral said there had been an accident during a munitions transfer. She said nothing, only moved to help the soldier clean the wound, her hands steady, her gaze unwavering. The Admiral watched her in silence, his eyes following the precision of her movements, until finally he asked if she had ever lost anyone. Under her care, she froze for the briefest second, then said, "Yes, sir." He nodded quietly and looked away. After the soldier was sedated, the Admiral asked her to walk with him outside. The rain had weakened to a mist. The sky heavy and low, they walked. Along the pier, the waves glowing faintly under the floodlights. He said he had been reviewing old reports, trying to make sense of the Emberfall operation, his voice low, almost reluctant. She said she did not believe in reports, only in what she saw. He nodded and said, "Then tell me what you saw." She stopped and faced him. her eyes cold and unwavering. She said she saw fire. She saw betrayal. She saw the faces of her team vanishing under smoke, while a voice on the radio promised rescue that never came. She said she waited 3 days bleeding into the dirt, believing that someone would return, until she realized that no one ever would. He stood there motionless, his face pale, the wind tugging at his coat. She said she knew it was his voice that last transmission. He whispered that he was ordered to hold back extraction, that it was never meant to happen. She asked who gave the order. He shook his head and said some truths, only destroy what little remains. She stepped closer, her voice rising, saying that silence had already destroyed everything that mattered. He turned his back to her, gripping the railing, his shoulders shaking with a weight that no rank could carry. For a long moment they said nothing. The waves below them crashed and hissed the air heavy with the scent of rust and salt. Then she reached for her collar, her fingers trembling, not with fear but with resolve. She told him he needed to see what his decision had done, and before he could stop her, she pulled her jacket aside, lifting her shirt just enough to reveal the scars beneath the lights reflected on her skin. Pale against the dark, the jagged line cutting across her ribs, twisting upward where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. It was not a wound. That healed clean. It was a story carved in flesh, a memory that refused to fade. The Admiral stared, his breath caught his eyes wide with something between horror and guilt. She said nothing. She simply let the silence speak for her. The rain began to fall again, gentle drops pattering against the steel deck. The Admiral took a step back, his mouth opening, but no words came. His gaze locked on the scars, his hands trembling. He whispered her name slowly, as if he were saying it for the first time. In years, Alina Voss. He said it again, the name echoing faintly through the mist, and she saw it then, the memory finally returning in his eyes. He remembered the field hospital, the burning wreckage, the transmission, the sound of her voice calling. For help, he remembered everything. He turned away, pressing a hand against his forehead, muttering that he had believed the report, that all were confirmed dead. He said that Command had insisted there were no survivors. She said Command lied, and he signed the lie. She said her team trusted him. Their commander, their admiral, the man whose promise of rescue kept them fighting until the end, and he left them there. She said she crawled out through the mud, dragging the dog tags of her team. One by one, hoping someone would come, but no one came. He tried to speak, tried to justify the orders, the chain of command, the impossible decisions of war, but she stopped him with a single glance, the kind of look that strips away rank and reason. She said, "No order can erase a soul. No mission can justify silence." She said, the scars on her body were not the worst ones. The real scars were on the truth he had buried. The Admiral's shoulders slumped. He looked older, smaller, the stormlight flickering. Across his face, he said he wished he could undo it. She said he could not, but he could face it. He could bring the truth to light. He stared at her long and hard, the sound of thunder rolling far off across the horizon. He asked what she would do. If he refused, she said then she would show the world what he saw tonight. He said that would destroy him. She said it already had. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain and the low moan of the sea somewhere far off. A ship horn echoed through the fog. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small flash drive, handed it to her, his voice rough. He said it contained the original reports, the ones that were never released. She took it without a word, their hands brushing for a moment, and in that touch she felt the weight of his guilt, and he felt the quiet fire of her resolve. Then without another word she turned and walked away, her boots splashing through puddles, her silhouette fading into the mist. The Admiral stood, alone on the pier, staring after her, the flash of lightning revealing the haunted look on his face. He whispered her name once more, but the wind swallowed it and carried it out to sea. He knew now that the ghosts of Emberfall were no longer buried. and that the woman he had left to die had returned not for vengeance, but for truth. And that truth was already unfolding like a storm that no wall could hold back. And as the thunder roared across the coast, he realized that his silence had finally found its voice. The night after the revelation, the base seemed quieter than ever the storm had passed, but the air was thick with a strange unease, as if the walls themselves remembered what had been said on the pier. Elena Voss sat alone in the infirmary, the flash drive in her hand, the rain dripping softly outside against the windows. She had not told anyone what happened. She could still see the look in the Admiral's eyes, the way his voice broke when he realized the truth could no longer be buried. Part of her wanted to destroy the drive, to walk away and let the sea swallow everything. But another part, the soldier part, the one that had crawled through fire, refused to stop. Now she had seen too much, lost too much to let silence win again. She connected the drive to the base terminal when the screen flickered to lifelines of classified data filled the monitor. Her pulse quickened as she opened the files. There were mission reports, photos, audio transcripts, and among them, one document stood out. It was marked with his signature and the red stamp of final authorization. It stated that Operation Emberfall had ended with all units confirmed KIA due to critical system failure. It was dated 3 hours before the final transmission, 3 hours before she had sent her last plea for extraction. The words burned into her memory like another scar. She scrolled further until she found the attached directive signed by a higher authority, someone whose name was blacked out, but whose code matched an agency she knew too well. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, and she quickly ejected the drive, sliding it back into her pocket. The door opened, and the Admiral entered, his face shadowed by exhaustion. He looked older now, his posture less rigid. He asked if she had gone through the files. She nodded. He sighed heavily, saying that what she had found was only the surface, that there were layers above him, decisions made by people who would never see the battlefield. She asked if he had ever questioned them. He said once, but the cost of questioning command was exile, and he had a base to run, soldiers to protect. She said soldiers like her team. He closed his eyes and said he had no excuse, only orders. For a moment, neither spoke, the hum of the equipment filling the space between them. Then he said that the men she saw him meet earlier were not from the Navy. They were from the same agency that issued the Emberfall directive, and they wanted to restart the mission under a new name. He told her he had refused, but refusal would not stop them for long. She asked why he was telling her this. He said, because he believed she still had a chance to expose it from the outside. She could move where he could not, and he owed her that much. She stared at him, unsure if it was guilt or courage that made him speak. Now he handed her a small envelope sealed with the base insignia. Inside was an old identification badge with her real name reinstated. Elena Voss Field, Medic, Command 7. She looked at it, the letters blurry through the mist in her eyes. He said that her records had been restored quietly under his authority, and that by morning she would be officially transferred to a civilian medical post. She asked if that was his way of erasing her again. He said no. It was his way of giving her freedom. Before those above found out what she knew, he told her. The truth always demanded a witness, but not always a martyr. She said she had already been both. He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze, saying only that he was sorry. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door and said that apologies were for mistakes, not choices, he said. Then maybe he had made too many of both. Outside, the wind had changed direction, carrying the faint scent of salt and engine oil across the docks. The night lights shimmered over the water like fractured glass. She walked slowly toward the barracks, her thoughts tangled between rage and sorrow. Her fingers brushing the badge in her pocket, it felt like a fragment of the past she once wanted to forget. But now it was her weapon, the proof of everything she had endured and everything they had denied. Behind her, the Admiral watched from his office window, his reflection merging with the stormy horizon. He lifted his hand, tracing the scar across his palm. The same scar she had noticed during inspection. It was from the same explosion, the one that took her team and nearly took him too, though no one ever knew he had been there. He had survived because she had dragged him out before the second blast, but in the chaos, she was struck and left behind, and the last thing he remembered was her voice screaming for help through the radio until it went silent. He had lived with that silence every day since, and now seeing her alive had torn open everything he had buried. He turned away from the window, sitting heavily at his desk. He opened the drawer, pulling out a sealed folder marked Confidential. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked up the phone, calling an old contact, his voice low and tired, saying he was done protecting lies that night. While the base slept, he sent a single encrypted message to a secure channel attaching the original files of Emberfall and the new directive before erasing all traces of his access. When it was done, he leaned back in his chair, staring into the darkness, whispering that the truth now belonged to her. At dawn. The base alarm sounded again. But this time it was not for a drill. The sirens wailed through the fog as helicopters rose from the landing pads, searchlights sweeping across the docks. Elena stood by the pier, her bag slung over her shoulder, the flash drive hidden in her boot. The envelope in her hand, she watched as armed vehicles rolled toward the command tower, men in black uniforms spilling out. She knew they had come for him and for the truth he had just released. She wanted to go back to help, but the Admiral's words echoed in her mind. "You still have a chance to expose it from the outside." She turned away, stepping onto the transport vessel as the engines roared to life, the wind whipping her hair, the horizon glowing faintly with the first light of morning. And as the ship pulled away, she looked back one last time at the base where it had all begun, the place where silence met truth and broke apart. Behind her, the Admiral stood on the tower watching her go, his figure small against the rising sun, his face unreadable, but his heart finally still. The sea stretched endless before her, the sun rising slow behind the clouds, painting the waves in gold and blood. She stood at the edge of the deck, her hand resting over the pouch that held the truth, the wind carrying the sound of distant sirens fading into silence, the base behind her shrinking until it was only a shadow. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight lift from her chest. Yet somewhere deep inside, the ache remained, the memory of those she lost, and the man who finally chose truth over command far behind her. Admiral Rains faced the men who came for him, his hands steady, his voice calm as he said he alone had leaked the files his fate sealed, but his eyes free for the first time. She whispered a quiet goodbye to the wind, knowing their paths had finally diverged. She had carried scars of flesh and scars of silence, and now both had meaning. As the horizon opened before her, she looked once more toward the east, whispering that some wounds are not meant to heal, only to remind the living to never forget.